This is a lesson to describe the clinical characteristics of schizophrenia. Although you don't need to fully know the characteristics before we start the topic of schizophrenia, you do need to have an awareness of what the illness consists of. One of the main problems with schizophrenia is that there are lots of misconceptions about the disorder. This is an episodic illness, and that means that it isn't there all the time. People who suffer from schizophrenia do not suffer the symptoms all of the time. This could mean that they suffer with it for a few weeks and then there's a break. It could mean that they have mild background symptoms. They could have a period of months where it's bad and then it would tail off. It's classed as a cyclical illness. So, what is schizophrenia? We often think of schizophrenia as being a split personality. This actually couldn't be further from the truth. It's a lifelong illness. There is no cure, and it affects 1% of the general population. I said earlier, it is not multiple personality or split personality disorder. That is a completely different condition. And it causes people to have a break, a psychotic break from reality. This is where people actually lose sense of what's real and what isn't. So someone with schizophrenia would find it difficult to know what was reality and what was in their head, or what they believed they could hear or see. These are some of the main characteristics of schizophrenia: delusions, hallucinations, problems with speech, occupational and social dysfunction. You need to be aware of these, as you will need to talk about the symptoms in order to evaluate the systems. It literally translates as split mind. And I think this is probably where the idea of split personality has originated from, but it isn't this. Something that people with schizophrenia always show is psychotic behaviour. And although we don't talk about psychotic illnesses anymore, psychotic behaviour is classed as behaviour where people lose contact with reality. So, what is it? It's characterised by a disruption of cognition and emotion. It's a disruption of thoughts. Some of you might have watched the film Girl Interrupted, and the idea behind that being that it is an interruption. It's a cognitive interruption that stops normal thinking patterns. It's also a profound disruption of emotions. You may not be able to react to things as you would previously. You may become mixed up. And what the effect of that is that it has a huge effect on your perception and the sense of self. There is a YouTube clip here which you can watch. If you click on the link on your video, you will be able to watch a simulation video of what it's like to be schizophrenic. It's quite strange, but when we're defining schizophrenia, we need to be aware of two different types of symptoms. They're classed as positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Lots of students struggle with this concept, but it must not be mixed up between positive as in good and negative as in bad. These must be thought of as positive as in addition to, and negative an absence of. So if you just think of it as a plus and a minus. Positive symptoms are anything which is an excess of normal functioning. And as you can see, there is a plus sign in the brackets. So anything that is beyond what an average normal person would have. The average person does not have hallucinations, delusions, bizarre beliefs or disordered thinking. So this is anything that is additional to normal behaviour. Negative symptoms are an absence of normal functioning, and you can see the minus sign in brackets. So, flattened affect, poverty of speech, inability to engage in goal-directed behaviour, unable to follow instructions, unable to meet any deadlines. Catatonic behaviour, if you click on the link you will be able to see an example of this. These are quite waxy, stiff movements where people can remain in one position for a very long time. These are all symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, one thing that you should notice with this is that we're looking at some complete opposite symptoms here, and it is very unusual for someone who's schizophrenic to have all of the symptoms. It's also unusual for someone who's schizophrenic to have all positive and all negative symptoms. Usually people who have schizophrenia have either positive or negative symptoms, and that's what makes this illness such a difficult illness to define. The way that we diagnose and classify schizophrenia is using a diagnostic system. There are two systems that you may have heard of, the DSM and the ICD. These are revised every few years. At present, the DSM-5 is used. You might find in most of the psychology textbooks that the DSM-4 is still referred to. But the DSM-5 came into publication in 2013. The ICD, we're currently on the ICD-10. The ICD-10 is what is used in the UK, although a lot of psychiatrists do tend to refer to the DSM. And they are basically two books of lists. In class, we will have a look at some of the examples of these lists. You might have looked at them in the first year. And they basically give the clinical criteria for how you would diagnose schizophrenia. These two systems are different. Consider what the problem might be. Two systems, one illness, but both systems diagnose slightly differently. Why might this be a problem? What would this potentially suggest for the reliability and validity of diagnosis? You need to know the main differences between the diagnosis for the DSM and the ICD. This is because you could be asked to discuss some of the issues with diagnosing and classifying schizophrenia. And obviously one of the first issues is going to be the fact that we have two systems. In fact, there are more than two systems. These are the main two. Here's an example of the current criteria from the DSM-5. As you can see, I've only included part of this, but you can see that criterion A includes 5 items, and it says that people must include or have at least one of these from this list. And then if you look at the bottom, it says at least 2 of the 5 symptoms must be present for at least 1 month. So you've got to have at least one, but 2 of them must be present for at least a month. One of the 2 symptoms must be delusions. In case you're not aware, delusions are when you believe things that aren't true. Most people who are schizophrenic believe delusions of grandeur, so they are something that they aren't. Hallucinations, which are usually auditory in the form of hearing voices, and disorganised speech. Most people who are schizophrenic are unable to differentiate between a voice in their head and somebody talking to them, so they might appear incoherent as they're having conversations with the person they're talking to and with the voice in their head. If you look at the YouTube clip, it will give more information on this. You need to be aware, definitely, of the idea that the symptoms must be present for at least 1 month, because this is different in the ICD. Moving on to the actual diagnosis. The idea of the two systems is that they both clarify symptoms and allow easy diagnosis. The point of having a system that is to an extent scientific should allow every psychiatrist, every physician to apply the same guidelines, and therefore every physician should be diagnosing schizophrenia the same. The problem is that there's actually a lot of overlap between them, and there are some differences. Both systems look for hallucinations, delusions. Some systems look for more for a different length of time than others. Make sure that you can check out the main differences between the two systems. The DSM is only for mental disorders, whereas the ICD actually includes physical illnesses. And if you look in your course booklet, you should be able to see an example of both of them. One of the key strengths of both of these classification systems is that they are regularly updated and revised. We're on ICD-10, so the 10th edition, and the 5th edition of the DSM. This shows that mental health is constantly updating, constantly moving ahead, and constantly responding to changes. This could be seen as a strength, but it could also be seen as a weakness. Continuing with diagnosis. One of the problems with having two systems is that it could be argued that they are culturally biased. This is probably because one system was created in Europe, Western Europe, the ICD, and the DSM was created in America. And it could be argued that these are systems created for a Western culture by a Western culture, and therefore we would find it very difficult to apply in collectivist, non-Western cultures. All the research that's been done to support these systems has been conducted in Western countries. Very little research has been done into schizophrenia in countries such as Japan, Israel, India. There are countries who do not recognise schizophrenia as being a mental illness. In fact, they are viewed as a kind of shaman if they hear voices. It's viewed in a very positive way. It must be noted that we are very ethnocentric with mental health, as we tend to view mental health in a more negative way in our culture. Consider all the issues that cultural bias can cause. You could be diagnosed with schizophrenia in America and have a different diagnosis in the UK because there are two different systems. If you were in a third world country, you wouldn't be diagnosed with schizophrenia at all. That brings into question, does schizophrenia actually exist? Can we even quantify and measure what schizophrenia is? If it doesn't exist all over the world, then how do we know what it is? It also questions the idea of there being two or more classification systems. Surely there should be one. There are lots of issues here with cultural bias, mainly surrounding the idea that the research was conducted in a Western culture. What you need to do now at the end of this session is to ensure that you know the differences between the positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. There are 3 subtypes of schizophrenia that you need to be aware of. They are in your course booklet. As you can see at the bottom, it says you do not need to know in-depth characteristics of schizophrenia. You'll only be asked about the explanations for them and the treatments. You also need to make sure that you can understand the differences between the clinical criteria for the DSM and for the ICD. This ends this session. Thank you.